Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the special LeadersAngle event with our guest speaker, Sir Moody Stuart. My name is Daniel Milan. I'm the head of the unit for corporate governance in Africa at the USB and also the KPMG Special Advisor on Ethics and Governance. I'd like to offer formal apologies from the Rector and Vice Chancellor, Professor Russell Botman, who really wanted to be here, but unfortunately has a prior commitment with Archbishop Desmond Tutu this morning. The Dean of Economic and Management Sciences Faculty, Professor Johan de Villiers, unfortunately can also not be here. And a special apology from the Director of the USB, Professor Ian Smith, who's in London at the moment and also really wanted to be here. Before I ask the Chairman of our unit, Professor Bob Garrett, to introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to take a few moments to introduce and to formally launch the corporate governance case study competition of the unit for corporate governance, which has kindly been sponsored by Hermes Equity Ownership Services Limited in the UK. This project was initiated by the unit because we feel that currently there's a lack of appropriate African case studies on corporate governance. And certainly based on our experience, it impedes education both at the postgraduate level as well as executive education. And through this competition, the unit hopes to make a contribution to the establishment and development of a database of corporate governance case studies on Africa. It is our intention to publish a selection of these case studies in conjunction with the Richard Ivey School of Business in Canada, the second largest producer of case studies in the world, and we've already had some discussions with them in this regard. Detail about the case study is available on the website, so I'm not going to bore you with the details, but in short, we're inviting proposals for cases to be written about corporate governance in Africa. The unit will then shortlist 10 proposals and provide an incentive of 10,000 rand each for the shortlisted candidates to write up the cases. We are putting together a panel of international experts that will select the winning entry with a cash prize of 40,000 rand on offer for the best case. Deadline for submission of proposals is end of November, and the winner will be announced in March 2009. The competition has been endorsed by the Business Ethics Network of Africa, and we look forward to making a valuable contribution to discussions about governance on the African continent. I'd like to thank Hermes, and in particular the CEO, Colin Melbourne, for their invaluable support in this regard. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to ask our chairman, Professor Bob Garrett, to introduce our guest speaker for this morning. Bob.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's an absolute pleasure. And I will speak for a very short time because the current person today is Smart, Chairman of Anglo American, but with a distinguished track record, particularly in the oil industry, as you know, Chairman of Royal Dutch Shell, and with an astonishing geographic spread to his career, going through Spain and most of the Islamic countries, particularly Turkey, Brunei, which I know extraordinarily well. And he's just intimidated me totally by saying that he could run the whole of this session in Dutch. So I think without further ado, Samar, what I will say is that when we do, he will speak for about 30 minutes or so. After that, we'll take questions on literally any subject. I was with Smart in London very recently, where the Lord Mayor of London convened a conference on responsible investing, and that couldn't be a more topical subject at the moment, and we can cover that as well as anything else. So Smart, you are very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and a pleasure and a surprise to see so many of you up early in the morning. This would certainly be early in London. When Daniel Milan, we were talking about the topic this morning, he suggested a title of something like, Can Africa Avoid the Impact of the Global Financial Crisis? And I said you couldn't have that question because the answer was manifestly no. So we changed it to mitigating the impact. But maybe I was perhaps a little gloomy on the subject, because I was very encouraged to see in the last week or so an article in the Financial Times, which is not necessarily the most optimistic journalistic organ about Africa, with the headline, "Africa is a glimmer of hope in the global doom." which I thought was extremely encouraging. And they went on to point out the changes that had happened in Africa over the last 10 years or so, the very positive changes in terms of governance and governments. And they pointed out that which is true, that the growth, the acceleration of the growth, the average growth of the continent actually predates the resources boom by several years. So it's not entirely a resources-driven growth. Having said that, I am going to talk particularly about, because of my background in the oil industry and the mining industry, particularly about the impact of resources, because the natural resources are extremely important to Africa. If we, and there's other encouraging news, I think. I was encouraged to see, I'm actually talking to someone yesterday from Chevron, that the West African gas pipeline, which has been talked about for many years, in the same Financial Times, they said it's going to start taking gas from Nigeria to Ghana and eventually on in the next month or so. Actually, talking to Chevron, who operate it, we discussed how much it had been delayed and why it had been delayed and so on. And it is slow progress, but nonetheless, that's an interesting step in providing the vital infrastructure for African growth between countries. If we look at the resource industry, for the past 4 years or so, the very high prices have led to, I think, an excessively optimistic outlook. And as the financial crisis unfolded, many people in the mining industry kept, I think, slightly whistling as they walked past the graveyard to point out that China would not be affected and that there was decoupling of the economies and so on, which also was plainly not entirely true. They argued that with China's enormous reserves and the absolute imperative of internal growth in China and of maintaining growth in China through internal demand, that Chinese demand for minerals would continue very high. The impact has, I think, now been seen, and in the way that markets do, they overreact somewhat, so everyone assumed that China was now on the point of practical collapse. Resource prices went down, and mining shares reacted likewise, very dramatically and very suddenly. I think both reactions were overdone, and we have in fact seen some correction recently. But the consequences of this on resource companies, whether they're mining companies or oil and gas companies, are quite plain to see across the board. Most companies have lots of projects built, grown in the last few years to meet the booming demand. And with demand and prices dropping, we see cash flow dropping, so to fund a similar stream of projects, one needs to borrow money, and of course that credit is simply not available. So something has to give. A bigger problem, I think, is the potential closure of mines where cost of production is above the current price. That's very variable for different minerals. It's different for platinum, copper, nickel, iron ore, and so on. And there's a different pattern for each one. In nickel and zinc, for example, which are not of huge importance to South Africa, the current price is about halfway down the global cost curve. So about half the mines in the world are actually producing at above the price. So there's obviously some serious problems in some metals. In that situation, mining companies and other oil companies are not entirely unhappy to defer projects. costs in the last 4 years have been enormously inflated. In almost any project which 4 or 5, say in 2002-3, would have had a price of 100, now has a cost of construction of 250 or 300. The inflation in projects and construction has been absolutely enormous. And therefore, some cooling, some smoothing of the boom would obviously be beneficial in some ways. And there's some signs that this is happening, but there are, of course, significant problems for countries if projects are deferred. So what is actually the impact on African countries? If we consider a country, a hypothetical country, with sound governance and a very conservative fiscal policy, who's been going along with reasonable growth, the immediate impact on commodity prices clearly impacts government revenue. Possible cutbacks in production causes problems of employment, and deferment of projects does both reduces future employment and future revenue. There probably will also, as we've seen in many countries, be accelerated depreciation of the currency, which has a beneficial effect in reducing the dollar cost of production, of mining production in those countries, but clearly has an impact on imported inflation. A country with less good governance will suffer a great deal more, as the income in the good times has been spent, shall we say, on unwise projects, or in the worst case, removed from the country. The need is going to be much greater. And when projects are being deferred, and companies are looking at which countries they defer projects in, clearly those with greater political and social uncertainty in less well-governed environments are going to be among the first to be deferred. The depreciation of the exchange rate is likely to be much more vicious, and because of the less representative distribution of wealth, with a reduction of national income, the possibility of social unrest is much higher in such countries. And rapidly we can see that effect. Now, when you look at this situation of governance and what can be done about it, and what the impacts are, I look at it from, as Bob Garrett said, I've lived and worked in about 10 countries across the world and visited operations, mining and oil operations in another 35 or so. And one of the great privileges of doing that, and pleasures in many cases, is to see over some decades what the impact of revenue from resources is and what it can do. But it's also true that one sees what the negative impacts are. And if I just give you 3 examples, because I'm an optimist, 2 relatively good ones and 1 bad one. In my early career, I worked in, one of my first jobs was as a geologist in Oman, which in the 60s was a truly medieval country. It had perhaps 2 doctors for a population of 1.5 million people. Healthcare, education was negligible. Healthcare was extremely basic. Practices like trachoma, an infectious eye disease, was endemic almost in the desert. Practices like female genital mutilation were common, and it was a very poor country. And in the intervening years, as a result of change of government, we've seen the development of a modern country with a not unreasonable distribution of income, good medical services, good education, quoted by the UNDP as an example of development, and a governance system with a bicameral parliament with women in the both chambers, the appointed upper chamber and so on. Not a perfect democracy, but a clear move in an enlightened, in my opinion, enlightened direction. Likewise in Malaysia, when I first worked in that part of the world, you could tell in Malaysia in the 60s what the occupation of a person was by their race. It was quite clearly the society was divided between Malays, Indian and Chinese, and people could guess what people did by simply looking at them. The economy was based on primary products, rubber, tin, oil and gas, and so on. And out of that, again, through a process of, not a perfect process, Malaysia is politically in some turmoil now, a modern economy has grown with the lack of this differentiation based on race over a period of 40 years or so. But again, use of revenue from primary products converted into real economic change and growth. In Nigeria, where I also work, the story is plainly less happy. And if one looks at the differences, in all three cases, the extractive industries were run by the same company. The same people were involved, people from different countries, exchanged, etc. And one comes to the conclusion that a lot has to do with the nature and motivation of governments. In Nigeria, they were often military rule, more interested in their own gain than that of the country. Having said that, if one takes some pride and pleasure in positive progress and the contribution of an industry, you have to also acknowledge a participation in the other process. So I'm not trying to absolve the companies, but I think the main issue is actually the governance of the country. So what can one do as a company if one lives and operates somewhere where the governance is, not to put too fine a point on it, a mess? I used to think, and many of my colleagues thought 20 years ago, that if we ran a reasonable operation, paid our taxes in the country where they were earned, didn't bribe people, had good staff development programs, reasonable community development programs for our neighbours, that if the government then took the money, the revenue generated, and blew it on unwise projects, or in the worst case stole it, that was extremely unfortunate, but that as a foreign company operating in the country, one should not get engaged in the politics. You have to remember that my generation, when I was at university, we talked and worried about companies like United Fruit and the origin of the word banana republic, which came from the interference of multinational corporations in national government. So we were brought up, as it were, on don't interfere and keep out of politics. I don't agree with that position now, but on the other hand, it's not easy to address, because you do not want a world where global companies are actually interfering in local governance and so on. Because however well-intentioned this might be, without controls, it will be bent in favor of corporations. That's simply human nature. It doesn't just apply to corporations, of course. I think there are signs of hope in this. One is the Global Compact, which was launched by Kofi Annan, which invited companies, but not just companies, to subscribe to 10 principles, 9 originally, the major United Nations conventions on human rights, on labour and environment and development, and somewhat later on corruption. To me, the power of this is not just getting companies to sign up, but the fact that the compact involves civil society organizations and labor, because if you want to address an issue in a country, it has to be done not just by the business sector, but by everyone in the country, by civil society and labor, working together with government, national and local, to address the issues. And one of the strengths of the Global Compact is actually its local networks, which encourages the coming together of these groupings. If you're going to work together like that, you need to build trust. And trust, particularly at the moment, but historically it's been quite low in major corporations. And if corporations are to work with civil society and others, we need to be very much more open, which is one reason why I've always been a very strong supporter of the things like the Global Reporting Initiative, which allows corporations in a standard form to report their performance in environmental, social and economic contributions. This is this question of the management of resources also is, and the revenue from resources is something of great interest to the mining industry. And there's been some very interesting work done by the International Council of Mining and Metals, which is a CEO-led organization of 15 or 17 major global mining companies getting together. And the work that was done in conjunction with development and human rights NGOs and so on, to take case studies, and they took case studies of 4 countries, 4 resource-rich countries, Peru, Chile, Ghana and Tanzania. And they tried to look at what had enhanced the process and what had not helped. If you look on the ICMM website, you can see the case studies, which I think are quite interesting. And you can see the kind of work list that has emerged on this, how one can look at the management and distribution of mineral revenues, what's happened to social and economic development in the mining areas, in poverty reduction, the very important impact of increasing local contact and local economic activity by mining projects, how those projects can integrate with local and regional development planning, and very importantly, and I think coming from the work of John Ruggie and others, the improvement of mechanisms for dispute resolution. There will be disputes, even between friends there are sometimes disputes. So if we're looking for solutions, I think it would appear that sound governance, both of countries and of companies, is an absolute key to the mitigation of some of the impacts. Avoiding the impacts, I suspect, is probably impossible. The world is not going to move away from having cycles. There will be ups and downs, and it appears firmly embedded in human nature that we forget about some things and make the same mistakes again. But I think we need to look separately in a country and globally. There's a tendency of people, particularly in the present situation, to talk about the need for global reform of the financial system to solve the problem. There are steps, I think, that one needs to take globally, but there is a big danger that if everyone looks at the global, we forget about the local, and that leads to countries, frankly, dodging the issue and blaming their woes on external events. And I've certainly seen that in the UK, for instance, where our government continually refers to the fact that this is fundamentally an imported problem which comes from the United States, completely ignoring the fact that they were doing exactly the same things. We had a credit boom, we had overextended credit, the government increased spending beyond the bearing capacity of the economy, and now has very little flexibility for fixing it, less than in the United States. So I think it's important not to instinctively blame the rest of the world for our own problems. In-country management of revenues, whether mining or general, I think has to take into account the principles of sustainable development. And that means it needs to be distributed fairly, with due regard to the local communities and the building of infrastructure and capacity. We talk about sustainable development in mining and resources. Fundamentally, in many of those resources, less so in metals than in oil and gas, the extraction is, in a way, fundamentally unsustainable. The only justification is if we can use the revenue and the wealth created by that process to convert that natural capital into other forms of capital. And how that's done, and whether it's done effectively, I think is absolutely critical. Companies have a role to play in that process, because we have infrastructure and capacity in local areas, whether they're operating and constructing skills, financial management, healthcare skills, and so on. So it's essential that we look in that process at local enterprise development beyond our immediate activities, and building local content is a key part of that enterprise activity into our supply chain. But it has to go well beyond our supply chain, because when the mining or extraction activity stops, if it's completely dependent on that activity, the local economy will collapse. And in order to do that, it's absolutely essential that we work with civil society and other organizations to build capacity in the community. And we look at that process of building relationships, including mechanisms for resolving disputes. And that, I think, is a new area and something that we haven't always been good at. So we should use the present shock, I think, to stop and think. If we have to delay a project, it can be a very good opportunity, not simply to walk away and leave it, but to work to establish a sounder footing and a better relationship. One of the outcomes of the many studies that have been done is that if the development of income is in advance of the establishment of some local governance and structures to handle that income, the result is nearly always negative. This is a conundrum, because do you wait till everything's perfect before you do something? And it doesn't, frankly, matter what that income comes from. People point particularly to resource income. But if you have a wall of money, whether it is from debt forgiveness, aid, or resources, if the capacity of the economy to absorb it and to handle those flows is not there, the results will be negative. So I think we can use the delay to build a better structure. We can also, I think, use, and this has not always been done, use the delay to build educational capacity, working again with others in an area before we start. One of the problems of moving into an area is there are enormous expectations of employment. But in an industry, you need people with a certain level of education. Very often in a community, that level of education simply doesn't exist. So if you can spend, and will not exist for some time in the future, so some working beforehand to look at training and levels of education before construction starts can lead perhaps to better outcomes. And I think we can again work with civil society and other organizations to prepare for the future income. I think government might also want to use the downturn to look at what they might do. For example, in this country, if you look at black economic empowerment, where some of those companies are coming under strain as a result of the downturn, it might be worth looking at what government support could be given in return perhaps for looking at whether the outcomes originally intended were actually being achieved. In other words, looking at whether the broad-based nature of this, which was the intention and the dream, is actually being achieved. And in the same way that governments in Europe and the United States are using that leverage of government intervention to encourage banks and others to move in certain directions, that might be something that would be worth thinking about. But there are things which we need in the global system, I think. And I think what we need is particularly in the multilateral institutions, that they should stand by, ready to help well-governed countries that are affected, as they almost inevitably will be affected by credit shortages and resource downturn and so on, to mitigate the short-term budgetary impacts and to maintain continued investment in issues such as education and health. In short, I think we could use the pause to catch our breath, as it were. And that's going to require a great deal of cooperation between government, civil society, and companies. Without this, I think, the reaction will be for all parties to take very short-term palliative measures, including cuts in the wrong areas, which will simply result in the cycle commencing again. I often think of some words of Kipling, who's perhaps best known as a rather jingoistic imperial writer, or the creator of things which have been used by Walt Disney. But actually he wrote some quite interesting Victorian poetry. And he wrote a poem, which you can look up, you can Google it, called The Gods of the Copybook Headings. And the copybook headings were the basic and fundamental rules which keep coming back to remind us when we've strayed off. And he said those gods of the copybook headings, they showed us each in turn that water would certainly wet us and fire would certainly burn. And they always caught up with our progress, and presently news would come that a tribe had been wiped off its ice field, or the lights had gone out in Rome. He also had some remarks about the market. I thought for over 100 years ago, quite prescient. He said, then the gods of the market tumbled, and their smooth-tongued wizards withdrew, and the hearts of the meanest were humbled, and began to believe that it was true, that all is not gold that glitters, and two make four, and the gods of the copybook headings limped up to explain it once more. So I think we need to think about cycles and the fact that they will inevitably return. Thank you.
on behalf of the USB and the Unit for Corporate Governance, I'd like to thank Sir Mark formally. I think the global financial crisis has focused our minds on the issue of change and rapid change. It's extended beyond the crisis to things like change manifesting itself in the US presidential elections, local political changes in South Africa, to the more anecdotal evidence of rapid change in the country club of Harare, where the price of beer goes up from one round to another. So you have to try and get in early after you've played a round of golf. All these things are related somehow to corporate governance. I'd like to thank you for your input and to suggest that perhaps what will happen as a result of this is for us to slow down, to pause and to think. Within complexity theory, there's been some writing about how the slowness could be extended from things like slow food or slow cities. Perhaps we should start thinking about slow business or slow industry, having been forced upon us, but it will give us an opportunity to rethink some of these issues and to see how things like governance and sustainability can provide that longer-term perspective and help us to move forward. So Mark is a very busy man. He arrived in Cape Town almost midnight last night, and he has to fly to London this evening for a few hours before he departs for Paris. So we really appreciate the time that he took out to come and speak to us this morning. We couldn't decide whether to give him yet another tie or another pen to thank him for his time. So instead, the USB has made a donation to the Cliffyville Primary School, which is one of the charities supported by the USB in 2008. So Mark, we have some information on the school for you, and once again, thank you very much for your time.